joining this session. Thank you so much for joining this session, this virtual side session during the OECD Garment and Supply Chain Forum. My name is Laura Chapman-Rubo, and I'll be moderating this session today, which is called Social Compliance Auditing in the context of CSDDD. If you're not familiar with CSDDD, it's been quite the talk over the course of this conference week and, of course, over the last year or two. But that stands for the European Union's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. Here today, what we wanted to do is bring together a really great group of panelists, all of whom touch upon social compliance auditing from a variety of different perspectives. And we're really looking forward to having them highlight their experience and how social compliance auditing fits in the broader realm of human rights due diligence. Just to say, human rights due diligence is a wide-ranging topic. There are lots of tools that companies can use to undertake human rights due diligence. Social compliance auditing is just but one tool in the toolbox. And it is something, however, that is very, very widely used. So we wanted to really kind of go a level deeper than maybe sometimes what we hear, and to describe a little bit about how it comes to life. Just a little bit of housekeeping for today's session. We are lucky to have over 1,000 people registered for this virtual session. And so, first of all, we're really grateful to you for your interest in this subject. We, of course, then are going to ask, or we will make sure that everyone is actually muted, but we really do want your engagement and your interaction. So we're going to ask you to ask questions, and we'll ask you to put them into the Q&A versus the chat feature that you see at the bottom of your screen. We'll also encourage you to start putting in those questions pretty early on. We have 90 minutes, and it will go by very quickly, actually. This session will be recorded, and the slides will be shared after the webinar. So if you thought what you heard was really of interest, please go back and view it again. Feel free to share it with colleagues. And then at the very end of this, we will also offer a satisfaction survey. It's not, are you satisfied with social compliance auditing? It is a questionnaire about, did you believe that this session helped to at least unpack a little bit the idea of social compliance auditing in the context of human rights due diligence. With that, you can see on the screen, we have representatives, experts. You have their bios, so I won't read them all, but just at the highest possible level, we have a collaborative initiative that has its social compliance auditing protocol and works with social compliance auditors. We have an actual social compliance auditor, someone who is certified to conduct social compliance audits, and this is her job. We have the head of the Standards Association for the testing and the certification of social compliance auditors, who will describe, along with others, questions people may have around testing for competency and integrity. And we have someone from Germany who people know that Germany has had a supply chains due diligence law for a little while now.
I think you're losing Laura, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, let's wait. She will hopefully be back in a second.
About is
Laura,
yeah.
You might need to go back a bit because you were phasing out.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
I know, internet, not our friend.
Yes. Can you hear me now, Linda? Okay, very good. I do apologize. I do have unstable internet. So anyway, we have these amazing panelists, as I was saying. If you heard me, we're not going to read their bios right now, but we have a selection of people from different organizations who all touch upon social compliance auditing in some manner. We have a collaborative initiative, which has its own protocol around social compliance auditing and who works with audit firms and auditors. We have an actual real life social compliance auditor, someone who has actually been certified and has years of experience in conducting audits. We have the standards body for the certification and testing of auditors, who will talk a little bit about their efforts to promote competency and integrity. And from the German government, or not from the German government, but from an organization that supports Germany's own human rights due diligence supply chain law, we have someone who is providing guidance and support to businesses around human rights due diligence and can reflect a little bit upon the role that auditing may play in that. Okay, so if you heard that, hopefully I will also say we are very happy to also have some polling questions for our audience here. We have 2 questions. We are really interested in understanding what kind of questions you have around auditing. The first question is really focused on this question of competency. What does it mean to conduct a competent audit? And what are the qualifications that an auditor should have?
Laura?
Yeah, I think we must have lost her a little bit.
Yeah.
So the poll questions are, like Laura said, the first one is the biggest challenge in auditor competence. And then the second poll is, what do you think are the biggest risks for auditor integrity? And auditor integrity is being sort of the ability of the auditor to do her or his job the way that he or she needs to do that. So what I would ask is that everyone answer these poll questions, and then the panelists are going to see those answers as time goes on. And our goal is to use your input, your thoughts and opinions to help frame our responses so that we can address how you think the social compliance audit industry is performing based on your answers to the polls. So please start answering those questions, and then we'll start seeing those answers as we continue our process.
Thank you for that, Rose. And I think as panel members, I think we need to step up a bit because I can see that Laura is still frozen in her screen. And Else, I think the poll questions are there. We encourage everyone indeed to step up and really use the poll. We can't do that as panelists and as hosts, so we're not going to diffuse, I would say, your answers there. And I think in the meantime, Laura, I think you are back here. I think after having done the introductory about, I would say, logistics and everything, I think it's really time to start the panel with, you trying to moderate in an unstable internet environment is not easy, but I think you're back. So floor is yours again.
Thank you so much. Thank you for tap dancing while I was trying to reconnect. Okay, so let's, Michaela, I want to turn to you first. Germany has had a law regarding due diligence, and we are not here to talk about that in great detail, but you are in an organization that operates a help desk, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit why does Germany have that? What are the kinds of questions that you get asked around human rights due diligence and to some extent around social compliance auditing as a tool on that? So maybe over to you.
So yeah, the Helpdesk is a free of charge advisory service that's funded by the German government, in particular by the German Ministry for Economic Collaboration and Development. And we provide advice to businesses and business associations and start our work in relation to the German National Action Plan, and now have expanded our mandate because of the Supply Chain Act, but also other legislation like the CSDDD or the EUDR. There's lots going on in general in relation to sustainability. And since we're free of charge, we get a lot of requests, and we also get a lot of requests from companies of very, very different maturity levels. So I can imagine that like other providers might get requests more from more mature companies, but we get requests from really everyone. We also get requests from companies who are too small to be in scope of the German Supply Chain Act. That's about 1/3 of the requests we get. And we do also get questions in relation to audits, but also questions in relation to everything else around due diligence. Yeah.
And then Michaela, so just rough ballpark figure, what percentage of the time are you getting questions about audits? Is it 5% of the time? Is it 50% of the time? Obviously, I don't need an exact number, but how much sort of curiosity, if you will, is there around social compliance auditing?
Yeah, I mean, it's like there's like cycles of when we get what types of questions. That also has to do with the political discussion, and when there's insecurity or stuff going on legally that has something to do with audits, we get lots of questions suddenly. So when there was discussion around the Safe Harbor and the Supply Chain Act, but also Safe Harbor in the CSDDD, there were more questions in relation to that. But generally, I would say I can't really say a number, but audits do play some sort of a role very often when we speak to companies about, in particular, in relation to the risk analysis. And very many companies will buy products that have been certified by a certain standard, and these standards are usually issued with audits or assessed with audits. And so in this context, they always play a role, and companies are always a bit confused because on the one hand, they find the audit is they understand it as the best way to assess the situation. But on the other hand, the law says that they still are responsible for their due diligence. And so they don't know what this means. So they think, but I have the audit, so I can say, okay, done. Yeah.
Right, and under the German law and under CSDDD, there's a sort of an ongoing obligation to conduct human rights due diligence, and it's understood that you don't just get to kind of check a box, once you have a kind of an audit in place. We may come back to you, Michaela. Let me actually turn to Ross. Ross, as the head of the Association of Social Compliance Auditors. This is a professional body which seeks to test and certify social compliance auditors. Can you just begin to explain what is APSCA? What does it do? And how do you begin to address questions around competency?
Sure. Thanks, Laura, and hi, everybody. So let me briefly describe what APSCA does. We are the global professional oversight body, and we're divided into really three big buckets. The first one is on the auditor side. We certify social compliance auditors, and once they become certified social compliance auditors, we ensure that they conduct annual training to keep up their skills, keep up with current events. So that's the exams and the continuing professional development part. We also have member firms. We currently have 72 international third-party audit firms that are members of APSCA, and they go through a review process to become a member in terms of their governance, oversight, training of auditors, handling ethics cases, and we're beginning to do annual reviews of those firms as well. And then the third bucket is we have what we call professional conduct, or another way of saying it is ethics. You can see on the right side of your screen that last year we handled about 325 ethics cases. This year we anticipate handling 450. So all of the cases that you hear around, if there's bribery, if there's audit or competency issues, they come under the APSCA umbrella, and we have a team that investigates those matters and, if need be, issues discipline to either the firm or the auditor. So to give a step back, if you look at the upper left-hand corner of your screen, you could see the number of audits globally that are under our umbrella. And you can see that that's increasing a lot year over year. This year, we anticipate over 230,000 audits that are sort of under our umbrella, meaning if there's any matters that come up in the context of those audits that implicate ethical issues or competency issues, they come under our umbrella. And in fact, I'm very excited to say that just earlier this week, we surpassed the 3,000 mark for the number of certified social compliance auditors, of which Raquel is one. And so very, very excited for that milestone. So did that answer your question, Laura, about who APSCA is?
Yeah, definitely. And I think we want to definitely come back and understand a little bit better the testing process, the competency, some of the standards, and the integrity process. But that actually is a good segue right now to introduce you to an actual social compliance auditor. So Raquel, you have spent a few years actually conducting social compliance audits. You are a certified social compliance auditor, a CSCA. Among kind of, a growing body of actual certified auditors. Tell us a little bit, how did you get to where you are? What is your background? And tell us a little bit about what does it mean to be a certified auditor?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Dora. First of all, let me greet everyone good morning and happy Valentine's Day. So I am based in the Philippines and I've been with Intertek, which is an auditing firm, for 32 years. So I started in Intertek doing factory audits when social compliance audit is not yet in the industry. But from doing factory audits, I shifted on doing small parts of social compliance auditing, like checking birth certificates of workers, until it is now grown up to where it is now. So I have the privilege of working as a social compliance auditor in total for 30 years and contributing to the development and implementation of standard operating procedures, enhancing the auditor qualification requirements, auditing process, and reporting system. Thank you.
And Raquel, just want to make sure I understood. It's 30 years you've been, or 13?
Yes.
30 years.
So, yes, since it started, Laura.
Yeah. And I think some people know this, but maybe just for the larger audience is, social compliance auditing as a discipline began really in the early to mid 1990s. And so, coming out of particularly the apparel industry, but then increasingly footwear and toys and electronics. So it's pretty incredible, Raquel, that you've been, in this industry for so long. And I can only imagine how many assessments you have actually done and how many workers you have met through the course of that process over time. So we may come back to that a little bit. Now, Linda, let me turn to you. Would like to understand, how does a collaborative initiative like yours think about human rights due diligence? How do you support the members in your organization, and how does social compliance auditing fit within the support that you do and the expectations you have of your members?
Yeah, thank you, Laura. And how it fits, and I think I'm just going to start with repeating what you said at the beginning. A social audit is one tool in the toolbox, and that also applies to amfori and our offering to our members. Our members are companies, big ones, small ones, around 2,500 across the globe, more than 50 countries. And their suppliers in even a larger number of countries. And we help them with their due diligence journey in more things than only audit. Audit is just one important step, but there is more things to deliver and work with them. And it starts with identifying your risk. It starts with prioritizing your risks. It starts with then, build capacity for the suppliers of our members. At some point in time, a decision is made that, maybe it's a first-time supplier you want to have an audit. Maybe it's a supplier where there were issues with in the past, where you want to have a repeat audit. And that helps you then to identify your risk. And based on that, and I think that's what we stand for, is that if you know your risk, if you identify your gaps, that's also where you will need to start looking into how do we close those gaps, because that's part of the continuous improvement cycle. So the due diligence journey is also the journey that we follow. So we also offer access to remedy. So if there is an operational grievance mechanism and for whatever reason, might not be working, might not be trusted, there is an alternative, say in addition to, offered via our Speak for Change program. What I think is also important to say, and I think we already heard it a couple of times, we are not taking over the responsibility of our members. We are not a safe harbor. So there's a lot of things they will need to do themselves internally within their companies to make sure that they have, say, the system set up. What we do jointly is that we join around this shared code of conduct. And of course, that code of conduct is based on the well-known principles from the International Labour Organization, from the OECD, from the UN Guiding Principles. And by doing that collectively, I would say we save a lot of money and resources, because you don't need to do it again, or you don't need to do the updates yourself if there's any change in legislation. But because we do this jointly, we also do joint auditing in a sense, because if an audit is being asked for by a member for a supplier, the other members that are also work with that supplier don't ask for an audit again. And I think that is really important. So we have on average 40,000 audits a year. But I can also say, on average, we do not have 120,000 audits a year just because of this shared responsibility. So if you look into how we contribute to, say, audit fatigue, I think that's our annual contribution. And that adds up over the years, because amfori PCI is already in the market for more than 20 years.
Thank you. Really important point, Linda, this idea of collaborative initiatives coming together to help combat audit fatigue. And your initiative is one that does that. The OECD also earlier this week produced a paper on sustainability certification schemes and raising questions about the usefulness, the value. There's some reference in there to the fact that collaborative initiatives like yours and others can help to create at least a common baseline set of expectations, a common code, if you will, so that individual buyers, brands, and retailers aren't all sort of enforcing their own thing that might be kind of 80% aligned, but the other 20% is not. And of course, that then is also, having all those different standards is a burden on the suppliers who are, already still probably hosting a lot of audits. But these collaborative initiatives seek to reduce that. And at the same time, auditors need to be competent, and
Yes.
and they need to follow a set of ethics. I think I want to turn back to Michaela, but unless Ross, I don't know if you were nodding because you had a kind of an intervention at the moment. If not, I'll wait.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
just what the idea of consistency in legislation globally is one of the things that APSCA is working on as well. We do have what we call our competency framework, which governs how competent audits should work. It's a very broad definition, and collaborative programs like amfori and SEDEX or SAI have their own set of standards, and brands and corporations have their own set of standards. But if you're going to legislate, one of the goals is to have consistency of definitions and processes around the world so that we're giving everyone the best chance to comply as more and more countries come online with due diligence legislation that in part requires social compliance auditing.
Great, perfect. And Michaela, then, I'm actually seeing a couple of questions in some of our Q&A, and I think there's a little bit of confusion about the status of the German law. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that in the context of the EU's omnibus legislation. And then, of course, I think what's implicit here, maybe we haven't said it, but within CSDDD, the European Commission is expected to produce guidance on kind of criteria for third-party verification and third-party collaborative initiatives. And so that's partly why we are talking today about this, because it's specifically in CSDDD. But Michaela, can you comment a little bit about this, the kind of status of the German law and the kind of the interplay with CSDDD? And of course, the omnibus we're still waiting for, but yeah, please let us know what you think about that.
I mean, I cannot make any predictions in relation to the future, and like none of us probably. Please correct me if I'm wrong, and if you have any news on the future, I'm happy to receive them. The Supply Chain Act is enforced. Just the reporting obligations are not being enforced by BAFA, but all the other obligations are enforced. And the BAFA is actually conducting investigations in companies. They can do that on their own behalf, or because an affected person has made an application for them to do that. And they are actually doing that. They're also fining companies. They've started fining, I think, a handful of companies recently, or will do so very soon. And And yeah, the Supply Chain Act is a law enforced in Germany. The directive, as a directive, needs to be implemented, transposed by the member states into the national laws, also in Germany. And this will lead to a revision of parts of the German Supply Chain Act. Of course, if the CSDDD is being changed, then the transposition law might have to be changed as well. And we're looking at probably 1 or 2 years of a legislative process in relation to one of the many omnibuses that are coming. There will probably be one that revises the CSDDD also in relation to the material obligations, but that might be only finished by the time member states have already had to transpose, because the deadline for that is July 2026, so a little over a year now. And the German ministries responsible for the Supply Chain Act and CSDDD are actually already working on a transposition law, and they have started working on that in, I think, October or November last year, and they wanted to pass it before the new election, but the election will be earlier than originally planned. It will be in a little over a week, and so this was not possible to do it earlier than that. Yeah, maybe so much about the German supply chain law, and I'm happy also to touch upon what CSDDD says in relation to audits and why that's so important, because I think for companies, I've mentioned it's a really important tool, but there's also confusion. They want to do the tick box and say, there's a standard, there's the audit, I am fine. And the problem is that in the past, audits have not only always been a reliable tool. They can be an incredibly helpful tool, but there are also problems with audits that the other panelists are a lot more expertise to touch upon than me. And I think the CSDDD and the German Supply Chain Act have this position in relation to audits because the quality of all audits is not overall very good, but sometimes audits are used to disguise the situation on the ground. And for companies, then it means, okay, I need to assess also whether this audit is reliable, whether I can use this as part of my due diligence. I need to see, like, how does this feed into my due diligence process? And for that, I think it's great that the CSDDD in the recital provides some orientation for companies what that means. You've already mentioned the guidance that the Commission will issue, which is sadly now also being postponed because of the omnibus. So talking about legal stability. But there's also some language in the recital that companies can use for guidance. So there's wording in relation to audits having to be objective, auditors having to be free from conflict of interest, them having to refrain from any actions that might jeopardize their independence. So I think this is something that kind of points towards general corruption prevention things. And then also auditors should be accountable for the quality and reliability of the audit. And so these are, I mean, this is not the answer to everything, and you could still discuss, like, okay, when are they objective, and how can I ensure accountability, and so on. So there's still lots of details to be filled in, I think, and I think the Commission guidance will do that. The guidance will be on fitness criteria for auditors, but also methods for companies to assess the fitness of auditors, and guidance in relation to monitoring accuracy, effectiveness, and integrity of audits.
Yeah, great answer. And I see, Linda, you have your hand up first.
Yeah.
So we'll come to you, and then Ross. And then I actually, I just want to cue for, I'm not sure who it would be best for, maybe Raquel. But there's also a question in the chat I want you to think about is kind of the integrity, the competency of audits is maybe best done by local people who speak the language, who understand the culture, versus people who are kind of flying in and out. And, Linda from a collaborative initiative, Ross from the APSCA initiative, Raquel, you as an actual auditor, how do you think about, are there standards, or there rules around, understanding the language, understanding the culture, understanding the law? So just begin to kind of think a little bit about that. But first, Linda, to you.
Yeah, thank you, Laura, and also thank you, Michaela, just for making a bridge there. Let me start with saying, I think social audits serve a purpose, and they are scalable. A human rights impact assessment serves a different purpose and are not so easy scalable. So I think we need to make that distinction as an example here. I think what is really important for us here as a scheme is, indeed, the integrity and the quality of our social compliance audits. And there is different elements to that. But it starts with what is the criteria that you have towards your monitoring partner, because that's how we call our auditing companies, where they will need to fulfill. That's also a reason why we don't have 200 of them, but a really small number, because also that really just is really important to make sure that you can exercise a strong governance around them. We also mandate our monitoring partners to be an APSCA member, but we also mandate our social compliance auditors. You can only do a social compliance audit for amfori if you are APSCA certified. And that's not the only thing. So we require more things than just only and just maybe to start with that one. It's not just something. Being an APSCA certified social compliance auditor is really a big achievement. And when I was in Vietnam at the APSCA conference last year, it really came out and think those auditors, I have to be proud about the achievement, because it's not an easy process. Not everyone passes the exam, so they should be proud. But in addition to that, we also require, say, really having experience in the field. So you must have had experience, say, in an X number of audits, but they also will be trained based on our methodology in the amfori Business Social Compliance Initiative, say, Code of Conduct, and our system manual about how we want you to conduct the audits there. So it's not a quick fix. It is an investment in time to be able to conduct those audits, and experience. I think Raquel is the great example there. Experience really does matter. Coming back to Michaela about integrity, yes, there are issues. I think full stop, there are issues. And that's where also we have our program in place as a collective scheme, but we also work with APSCA, because some of the issues are, not only for us, also for others. They are industry-wide. And what we don't want is, say, any non-ethical auditors or non-ethical companies to stay within the system, because that doesn't serve, that's not good for anyone. So I think, in addition to our own, say, internal auditing assurance program, the collaboration with APSCA is really important for us. And Ross showed a slide about the number of cases being identified. And that probably is, if you maybe compare that to what is also happening in internal investigations, it might be even, it's much more, but it also has consequences. And so we do have auditors where we say, after thorough investigation, with or without APSCA, you can't conduct any more social compliance auditors. But the same can also happen to individual auditing companies or part of their specific countries, if there's also really issues identified, that they also cannot do longer business with us or with other schemes. So there is really consequences if there is non-ethical behavior being identified. And I think that's really important. And then coming back to the last question that you asked about how important is it that an auditor understands, say, the culture of a specific country and the legislation of a specific country, as well as speaks the language. Yes, that is super important. So that's also why we say we need to have local auditors. That's the ideal world, but we don't live in an ideal world. We also sometimes have countries where we do not have enough social compliance auditors that fulfill the qualifications, sometimes just because there is low demand. Sometimes maybe it becomes a country where there is really only a few suppliers in there. And then you will need to work with, maybe the second best option. And that is that, send auditors who maybe come from surrounding countries. And maybe you do that with someone that is there as an interpreter. And I think that's, it's not ideal, but sometimes I think that is the reality too. And if I make one comment, because I saw that also as a question popping up about the duration of audits also being relevant with regards to integrity and quality. And I think that's a fair point being made there. And I know that we cannot change the world on our own, but within our audit, we always include hours to make sure that an auditor has the time to write up the report. So because we recognize that having enough time is rather important, and we need to give them also the time to write up the report. I'm going to pause here. Much more I want to say, but I'm pretty sure that others want to chip in here as well.
Yeah, I think Ross had his hand up first, if you still want to come in, and then we'll go to Michaela.
Yeah, some really good points. On the discipline, we've revoked the license of many auditors. some for accepting bribes. Things like bribery occurs. That's why APSCA exists, is to work with groups like amfori, our member firms, to identify those cases and make sure those auditors can't audit again. Their APSCA credentials are gone. Member firms has lost their ability to perform. So we have a global enforcement mechanism through APSCA to identify these issues, and more importantly, identify the root causes of the issues and share that back with our member firms and collaborative programs to say, yes, bribery occurred. Why? What were the conditions that led to that? How do we get our collaborative programs and member firms to recognize those conditions to try to reduce the chance, that it happens again? But one of the funny things about social compliance auditing is it did grow up as people have viewed it as, well, that's your entire due diligence program. We've heard a number of people already say that. It shouldn't be. I mean, I would love to say it's the answer for everything, and it's not. It is part of a due diligence process, and it is a snapshot in time. I think of it as like you go to the doctor, and the doctor, you're there for 15 minutes, they take some tests, they give you a prescription, you go away. Well, maybe tomorrow you feel badly in a different place, or maybe you didn't eat well, maybe you didn't exercise, maybe something else happened. A social compliance audit is a snapshot in time, and because it is so worker focused, so person focused, it's hard to get everyone's perspective at any one time. And so a broader due diligence process of working with your suppliers, working with your factories, training your internal staff on human rights risks in the supply chain are a big part of the broader due diligence process. So if people think social compliance audit is the end-all be-all of responsible business conduct, then I think you may be disappointed in the social compliance auditing result. But I will say my last comment on that is Michaela did a great job of outlining what Recital 52 says is required for social compliance auditing. Competency, integrity, independence of both the auditor and the firm. And without going into too much detail, that is what APSCA covers. We require those elements of our auditors, of our firms, in order to achieve what we call a competent audit.
Thank you, Ross. Michaela, I want you to come in. Then Raquel, I want you to think a little bit about describing what it took for you to become a CSCA. Did it take days or weeks or months, and what were some of the steps? And then after that, we have some poll results, and I want to show those a little bit, and then I'd like for the panelists to comment on that. So, Michaela.
Yeah, just very briefly, I mean, Linda emphasized the necessary, or how important it is that auditors have local expertise, language skills, cultural expertise, know the local laws. And that's actually something where I think these audits are incredibly important and incredibly valuable if they're done right, if they're by a reliable auditor. Because the companies don't have this expertise internally. Sometimes we speak to companies and say like, oh yeah, we're going to do a quality assessment. And so we want you to help us figure out like what kind of questions could we ask to also look at like human rights aspects. And that's so incredibly difficult to do, because if you don't have this expertise, you cannot send your quality auditor to a site where they're looking at all kinds of things and then see all of these human rights problems that are usually very, very hidden. And there's in particular problems like I've once spoken to a company that came back from China and said we didn't see any forced labor. Like, okay, this is not really something you see, and we have to also account for the fact that very often audits are announced, which also is important in many contexts, because you can't just come to your supplier and say, surprise, please stop what you're doing. I'm here now and we need to do an audit for 3 days. And I think in this context, I want to highlight that it's really important to also, in the context of audits, and that standards are very, very different in the way they're being audited as well. But it's really, really important to also engage with rights holders in a way that is meaningful. So in a situation where they're safe to actually speak up for themselves, because this can kind of correct impressions that the site is, the factory is being polished a little bit because of the audit, and so they can kind of maybe correct and share more of what the everyday situation on the site might be.
Thank you. Raquel, can you talk a little bit about what it took for you to become a certified social compliance auditor?
Perhaps I'll put them into three buckets, Laura. The first one is the skills and competencies. Social compliance auditors like me require a wide range of skills and competencies to execute social audits, including knowledge on forced labor, child labor, discrimination, compensation, health and safety, and local labor laws. Familiarity also with international standards such as the ILO Convention is also required. In addition, minimum training requirements include completion of a social auditing training course, as well as a number of social audits that are under supervision to ensure competence on the skills to conduct the audit. Interpersonal skills are very crucial for social auditors like us. Effective communication is essential for interviewing employees, discussing findings with management, and engaging workers or union members to gain more understanding of their working conditions. The second part would be the ongoing training. Auditors undergo continuous education, including field training, encompassing new interviewing techniques, emerging human rights issues and trends, management system, and adherence to a code of ethics and integrity. Ross has made mention about APSCA and Linda as well as a member audit firm and auditors. The audit firm requires that we pass a rigorous three-part examination. You asked me, Laura, how long it took me. Because I've been in the field for quite some time, and I took it, once I passed one exam to another, it took me around 6 months. And that's the only way for us to lead any social compliance audit. And the audit firms like us must implement systems for continuous professional development, shadow witnessing, management audit quality and integrity, and of course, compliance to the APSCA code and standards. I think through these measures, the social compliance auditing profession upholds high standards, ensuring the delivery of quality audits, and will be successful also on their path for becoming a social compliance auditor.
So that's amazing. 6 months. So even with 30 something years of experience in social compliance auditing, the process was such that it took 6 months to get through all the stages. Yeah.
Because there are some administrative processes, but if it's all in good timing, you can perhaps do it a little lesser, like perhaps 3 to 4 months.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ross, do you want to come in on that? Otherwise, I'm going to ask the administrators to kind of pop up the poll results if we can get to that in a minute. But Ross, please.
No, actually, I'm kind of excited to see the poll results. One of the things we've worked on at APSCA is you can, if you have the educational and the training requirement, get through the exam in as little as 2.5 months. So we've worked really hard to make that exam process much more efficient. Okay, now the poll results.
Yeah, so hopefully people can see this on the screen. My first reaction is actually it's a lot more evenly divided than I would have expected. I think I was anticipating that there'd be a certain answer that would really dominate. But let me ask you, panelists, what do you think? What are your reactions to this? Are there any surprises, not surprises? Is there anything that, from your organization's perspectives, or there's certain priorities that you have to try to address some of these concerns around question number 1 and on competency, and question number 2 on integrity?
If I may, Laura, I echo what you said. Indeed, it's quite evenly distributed, but it also, I think, points out to the fact that we just can't do one thing. I think we will need to make sure that we also really address all of those. And if I read those questions, it's also not something that every one of us can do individually. There is this collaboration that is really required. APSCA has a role to play, collective schemes have a role to play, monitoring partners of auditing companies have a role to play, but also how we are going to make sure that we keep them up to speed on, say, any change in regulatory requirements. And say, coming from a business background, say, all these legal requirements can drive business also crazy, but not only business, also the one that need to work with those business to really to probe whether or not their standards are being met. And so I think it's also up to us to really try and to influence that, say, any legislation that it's going to be, say, is as similar as possible, coming, say, back to the transposition of CSDDD. I know things are up in the air with the omnibus legislation, but if we really talk about transposition of the legislation into the European countries, I really, really hope that, it's going to be, say, as much as copy-paste as possible in that transposition, because that also will help also auditors who need to, say, apply, say, understand the rules that apply to, say, in conducting an audit. It also makes, I would say, makes their life a bit easier. And maybe one thing, if I may, because I haven't mentioned it, and I think it's important that everyone on this webinar understands that. For amfori, APSCA is important. And that's also why I dedicate time to APSCA. So I'm an APSCA Stakeholder Advisory Board member already even before I joined amfori, I'm the chair of the Stakeholder Advisory Board. But as a Stakeholder Advisory Board member, because of the structure that has been within the governance of APSCA, I have also been elected to be represented at the board of directors of APSCA. So I spend a lot of time on APSCA, and I do that with a lot of love, but also because it's really needed, because we all need to pull together here to make sure that we really walk in the right direction. I just wanted to be clear for everyone that there is a bit, say, of dual hats here in this webinar. Thank you.
Yeah, and going back to CSDDD, because there is this provision in the document about the kind of the criteria by which we should all assess the the quality and the integrity of social compliance audits. Are some of you all talking to the Commission or members of Parliament about best practices, or about kind of fundamental criteria that the European Commission should consider when they perhaps ultimately do produce this guidance?
Yeah, the short answer is yes to that. And I'm pretty sure that Ross is also, might want to chip in on that one. And I think it's really important also, and I think we started the webinar with this, really explaining what a social audit is and what it isn't. Because sometimes that is still unclear. And we, maybe say as practitioners in this field, we have a good understanding. And we need to get better in conveying that message to explain what it is and what it isn't. And maybe that's, maybe Ross, if I can ask you to chip in here, say with your APSCA hat, because it's an important point for APSCA.
No, it is, and I had mentioned it earlier that we welcome national legislation on incorporating human rights due diligence. It's welcome. I remember when I started in this field, it was a nice to have. And I remember, having to work to justify why do we need to do this when it's not required. So in a way, now that it is required, it kind of makes our job easier. But we've already spoken with members of Parliament. We've been engaging here in Paris this week to say that you're going to get more and better compliance the more consistent global legislation is. And as the EU goes, I think a lot of other countries are going to go. As Canada, as Thailand, as other countries begin to legislate, they're going to look to here in the EU for those standards. So getting it right out of the box is going to be very, very important, especially as, and I hate to bring up trade given the global world right now, but so much of trade policy is now connected to forced labor, especially from someone who happens to live in the United States, that the importance of social compliance auditing and due diligence isn't just a legal requirement. It could affect a company's trade and supply chain. And if we can't source from a particular country, what happens to the workers if all of a sudden that factory loses the orders? So we have to be careful that social compliance auditing takes into account the global impact of what may seem like what happens in Germany or in France only happens in Germany and France. That's not how that's going to work. So yeah, we're working really hard on that. And if I can just reflect on the poll results, it actually makes me feel better. I feel the same way at APSCA. There's not one thing that's like, this is the only one thing that we can work on. All of these things that the listeners have said, hey, this is important to me. It's stuff that we're working on as well. So it makes me feel better that I'm thinking about this the right way, that there isn't necessarily one big thing we need to work on. There's a body of things that we work on, both as APSCA, with collaborative programs like amfori, with member firms like Intertek that Raquel works at. And one of the big things I'll focus on is, the rapidly changing regulatory requirements. One of the things we're developing now is training courses on legislation for auditors. In other words, yes, Raquel is right. She's a beautiful auditor. She has all of those skills in the factory. But if we can train auditors on this pending and existing legislation to provide the context for the work that they're doing, I think it makes auditing better. And I think broadening the skill set of auditors outside of the four walls of the factory is going to continue to evolve the quality and efficacy of social compliance audits.
Michaela, at one point you had your hand up, and so please come in if you'd like to, but I want to prompt another question. There's a difference between the audit protocol, right? So like amfori, for example, has an actual audit protocol. There's a difference between how you design the audit versus how you think about auditor standards, right? So let's come back to that question in just a minute. I'm just thinking, like Raquel too, you've probably been trained in many, many different types of audit protocols, whether it's amfori or kind of a brand audit. And yet APSCA doesn't set the standards for that, but you do set standards for the competency and the knowledge that an auditor should have to be certified. So I want you all to kind of think about that in a minute. But Michaela, you had raised your hand. Did you want to come in? You're okay. You're good. Okay. Good. So anyone want to comment on the difference between standards for an audit protocol versus standards for an auditor and the competency skill set?
Yeah, I can certainly give a start to that, Laura. The APSCA standards are wide-ranging because there are hundreds of protocols out there. amfori has one. My last job with LLB, we had one. Many other brands and companies have one. There are hundreds that are out there. And they focus on different things. Some may do more on health and safety. Some may do more on working hours. Everyone has their own focus and their own need, but all competent programs out there have commonalities, and APSCA oversees those commonalities. So in our standards, without going through details, please go to theapsca.org if you want to read in detail. But when we talk about competency, we have two categories. We have sort of operational competency, and then we have subject matter competency. The subject matter competency, I won't repeat because Raquel nailed it. What she said makes a good auditor are requirements that we have in our auditor competency framework that says that this makes what a competent auditor is. So I won't repeat that. What we do here is we set a framework for what an operation of a social compliant audit needs to be. Some examples are we require that an audit has to be at least one audit day, one person working a full day at the site being audited. Another example is going to be remote audit versus in-person audit. An APSCA competent audit has to happen 100% in person, not exchanging emails, not looking over a video. We require document review. We require triangulation of evidence. In other words, how much evidence and what kind of evidence is competent to lead to a finding that an auditor will put in a report. So those are two of the big buckets that sort of APSCA oversees. And then underneath that definition, then firms and audit schemes and protocols can do what they want and check and adjust as they need to.
If I just may add one thing, because Ross, you really say, explained it beautifully, but it also, again, I say, underlines the importance of, say, this collaboration. So every actor has an own role to play, but if we don't interact, if we don't collaboratively work together within the industry, we will not make the progress that we need, but we also will still continue to duplicate, say, which we might be able to avoid. So I just want to make that point in addition to what you said. Thanks.
I'm back. And now to Michaela.
Yeah, talking about collaboration, there's some other aspects in the CSDDD that do relate in some way to audits, and that is that in the articles on preventive and corrective action, it says that when the supplier is an SME, they should have access to the audit results when the obliged company agrees, or when they have paid a certain share of the cost for the audit. And I think this tries to address the situation of audit fatigue, that sites are being audited a lot by different organizations, different buying companies, and companies should instead, join efforts, because then they can put more resources, have a higher quality audit, and then also reduce burdens on the company. And there's lots of initiatives in Germany that are doing that, and they're facing a problem of this first mover problem. So they say, okay, we share the audit results, but then nobody wants to do the audit because the others do benefit financially, and also quite costly. So I think the idea of saying, okay, a certain percentage has to be paid by the audited company, then they get the results. It's a good idea, but we also need to look at, you don't want this direct financial stream between the auditor, I think, and the audited company to reduce risks of audit fraud.
One of the pieces of criticism that comes up around social compliance auditing, actually, there's two things I want to mention. One is, and it's been referenced before, and that's called unannounced versus announced audits. And so question number one for anyone who wants to take it is, why would you conduct an announced audit? What are the circumstances under which that is necessary? So that's question number one. Question number two is, especially in the context of CSDDD, when we see things like the need for meaningful stakeholder engagement. One of the things I think that people assume is that during the conduct of an audit, that unions are not engaged or workers are not engaged. But of course, I think under almost all audit protocols and under APSCA standards, it's required to talk to workers. So maybe you can all talk a little bit about that, and especially Raquel on that second question about how do you engage workers, and does it include union representatives where unions may exist? So Linda, you first, please.
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to come in on, say, the unannounced audits, but also on the announced audits, because I think I think it's really important to make that point. Within amfori, we have three categories. You have fully announced, semi-announced, and unannounced. And unannounced audits, they very often then, there is a suspicion that really something is wrong. There is really strong signals that you really want to go there unannounced. So that is something that doesn't happen too frequently, and very often there needs to be good reason for that. What we decided last year is that we would stop fully announced audits, because we think they don't serve a purpose. That was not an easy decision to be made. Not all of our members appreciated it, but we really felt this is really important to make sure that, say, audits, the credibility and integrity and transparency is there. Semi-announced is more or less, I would say, the standard, and it gives an indication to a supplier the period, say, in which a social audit can take place, without pinpointing, say, a specific day. So they still have, say, some time to prepare in general, but they never know exactly when the audit will turn up. So in conclusion, fully announced, no option anymore. Unannounced, exceptional, must be a reason, and semi-announced more or less is the standard here. And with regards to meaningful stakeholder engagement, I think over to Raquel, but that's also, of course, we also, as part of our auditing protocol, say this worker engagement or worker representative engagement is part of it.
Yes, perhaps I can just supplement on that part, Linda, because part of our program for every social compliance audit, interviewing employees, both workers and perhaps supervisory positions, and even union members are included in our scope. So this is where the effectiveness of communication, it really matters, because we should be able to get a full understanding of their workplace conditions. They are always part of our process. They are the core information that we can begin with to triangulate from other processes of the audit.
Yeah,
I want to start.
I'm sorry, Laura.
No, go ahead, Ross.
And Raquel's experience mirrors, again, what we call the competency framework. So in order to be a competent auditor, and Raquel is a amazing, super competent auditor, but to be a competent auditor, when you're at the factory, if freedom of association is a required subject matter for that auditor to delve into. So if there's a union, you check on the effectiveness of the collective bargaining agreement. If there's a union, is there an effective grievance mechanism? If there isn't a union, is there an effective grievance mechanism? Are elections allowed so that the workers have the freedom to choose their representatives in a safe and independent environment? And so if you take a look at our requirements in detail on the website, you'll see what we require the auditor to do in order to achieve that competency level. And if for some reason during the audit that doesn't happen, and significant portions of what we consider to be a competent audit don't happen, then that goes back to our professional conduct team, and then we can begin that investigation process.
Very good. We just have about 25 to 30 minutes left, and we have answered some of the questions already that are coming through the Q&A, but I want to start to pick off a few more of them. There's a couple of questions. I'll probably maybe ask 2 or 3 questions at a time, and the panelists can jump into whichever questions they feel they have a contribution to. But someone's asking a question about audit firms competing for customers on price. Some audit firms perhaps, charging less, some charging more. And so I don't know if anyone has a kind of a comment. You can read the question a little bit more clearly in the Q&A if you'd like. But the idea here is that maybe it introduces some pressures on the auditors, either do audits fast or to take shortcuts. So there's sort of a question in there, but number one, and then a question also that's in there is some auditors, it's being suggested, conduct maybe 75 audits per year. And how is that impacting their auditors' own well-being, like their own labor standard, their own working conditions? And I wonder if any of you can comment a little bit on how to, and actually, Linda, you sort of mentioned it, that in your standard, you do allow time for report writing, right? Because auditors have to take time to travel. There's report writing time. So.
Yeah, if I may come back to that, and I wrote it in my preparation for this panel, a lot of things I thought, oh, that's maybe important to share, and that's actually one of them. Social compliance auditors, I think it's a great profession to be in. It requires a lot of skills. They are extremely broad, I would say, and rounded in what they can deliver, what they know. I think they are, to some extent, human rights experts, say, at the front line of what we are doing here. But we also have to take care of the working conditions of our social compliance auditors. And it is an issue, and it is a concern in the industry. It is about travel time. It's about the number of audits. It's about work-life balance. It's about finding the time, say, to work on your continuous improvement and acquire, say, the newest and latest insights of what you will need to do. And I think that's where, as an industry, as a social compliance industry, I know that in the talks that we have with our monitoring partners, in the talks that we have within APSCA, it is a point of attention. We haven't found the silver bullet here. One thing maybe to add here, and I'm not saying that that is the solution, but what we view is that if we can move more towards a risk-based assessment before you decide to go into an audit, that might maybe help also a social auditor to really focus on things that matter more, so that within the time they have, they add more value. But that's still, I would say, we are making steps internally to make that happen, but it's not easy because there's still the auditing protocol. I can see that Laura is freezing again in the screen. There's still the auditing protocol. There's a lot of things that will need to be checked off. So how do you do that in the right manner? And it's also a bit about giving them, say, freedom within the framework, and really, giving them the, I would say, the kudos they need, the social compliance, or that they have the professional and the skills to really deep dive into those topics that matter most, without forgetting, I would say, the basics here. So that's a bit, say, in response to, say, audit and social compliance auditors, and they are people too, and we will need to take care of them too. I'm not sure, Ross, if you want to come in on, because I also see a hand from Michaela as Laura left.
I'll go to Michaela in a bit. I think you did a good job of addressing announced and unannounced, Linda. The idea of the amount of money paid for an audit. APSCA stands for the professionalization of the industry. And if I take a step back, and even though I'm relatively new at APSCA, one of the benefits of creating a profession is showing the value of it. If there's more value of it, people pay more for it. And really interesting fact is compared to quality auditing, social compliance auditing receives less money per factory visit. I don't think the social compliance auditors are any less skilled, and maybe I'm biased, and I think they may be more so, because there's that human element. Interviewing workers is really challenging, and Raquel is really good at it. But one of the things, as my goal is to professionalize the industry and frankly get more money into that auditing ecosystem so that we can continue to professionalize in every way, shape, and form that entails. And so that's something that people like me and Linda and everyone is working on, to try to work with brands and retailers in the broader ecosystem to show the value, and have that be reflected in pricing that goes around. And I'll turn it over to Michaela.
Yeah, so I want to touch upon the risk-based approach that Linda mentioned, because something that we're observing in relation to the German Supply Chain Act, but also CSDDD or the CSRD, not in particular in relation to audits, but in relation to all due diligence obligations, and most importantly in relation to the risk analysis, is that companies somehow think, and I think this has a lot to do with them being really poorly advised, and lots of misinformation being out there, and also lots of misinformation in relation to the political struggle around these types of laws, is that they think they need to investigate all of their suppliers, or they think all of their tier 1 suppliers. And then many big companies under the German Supply Chain Act will have between 50,000 and 100,000 tier 1 suppliers, most of them being based in Germany. So they're not really interesting for this exercise, at least like in most branches, not saying that Germany is perfect. And so I think it's a great idea to emphasize more. I think we need to emphasize this more, because I can imagine I would be interested in hearing what you hear from companies, that in the context of the audit, they should focus on the issues that are actually relevant. Because I can imagine companies saying, like, I want you to assess all of these things everywhere, all the time. And then with the CSRD, it's very similar with the materiality assessment. Companies need to figure out what is material, and they don't need to report on all of these thousands and so many data points, even though they think they do, because they need to figure out what's material. And the criteria for this prioritization are essentially the same, the Supply Chain Act, CSRD, and the CSDDD.
If I make, Laura is back. Great. If I may just come back to the comment you made about, German companies that have also used supply chain in Germany. And I know that you didn't say that, but I just want to make the comment here that, we always have this notion about we have high risk countries and low risk countries. But even if a country in general is low risk, it doesn't mean no risk. So I also just want to make the point here that, say, social compliance audit is not just something that we need to do in Asia or in Africa or whatever things we have in our mind. There can be issues everywhere. I live in the Netherlands. Next door, probably in the harvesting season when we have our fresh asparagus, there might be forced labor or, say, non-decent work conditions. So it's in each and every country. And just want to make that point also in addition to, say, the risk-based one and, tier 1, and we can even go on to tier 2. But I think it's an important notion to acknowledge that. And that's up to, say, the risk assessment and the prioritization for each and every company. Laura, I know that you're chipping in here, but I think, Ross, you wanted to come in. Was that correct or not?
Nope, I think I weighed in.
Ross, there's a couple of questions that have come into the Q&A about, one is how to become a social compliance auditor. Can you talk a little bit about the process to do that? And there's another interesting question there about the most common ethics cases. Can you describe a little bit about, are there certain trends? Are there certain, how do you get complaints? And I think you touched upon this a little bit earlier, but how do you get complaints, and maybe what are some of the most common ones? So maybe to the easy question first is how to become a social compliance auditor and an APSCA certified auditor.
Sure. Again, I'll direct you to the website, but long story short, if it starts with education, do you have an advanced degree after high school? And then after that, you need to have some prior audit experience of 20 audit days in order to be able to sit for the exam. So education, a little bit of experience in the industry, and then we have a 3-part exam. Part 1 is written, and it's a very kind of like textbook test about the social compliant audit industry. Part 2 is also written, but it puts you inside the factory and asks you questions about how would you explore things like freedom of association or working hours. Part 3 is a mock interview, a practice interview where you're sitting down and you're meeting face-to-face over the computer with someone who's pretending to be a worker or multiple workers. And you're assessed on a set of criteria on how you engage with that worker. You can't just say, hey, how much are you getting paid, or have you been harassed? There's an art form that Raquel can speak to a little bit better probably than I can about, are you listening? Are you using different communication skills? Can you read body language? Are you picking up on words? There are skills in there that we look for that I think sets aside a competent auditor from one that isn't quite competent. And so that entire process is detailed on the website. We also have over 275 approved training programs. APSCA doesn't create the training. Groups like amfori do and Intertek do. And if that training meets the APSCA competency framework, then it's an approved and it's good, like amforis and Interteks are. You can take that training and it will help you learn what topics can be covered on parts 1, parts 2, and parts 3 of the exam. So you come into the exam process knowing what the topics are going to be because it's the competency framework, and you have free and low-cost resources to get trained. And then depending on what country you're in, places like Italy and Brazil and Japan, we actually have local language deep dive trainings on what the competency framework and exam process is. So that's on that. Ethics cases, where do they come from? And how do you report them? Let me start with sort of where they come from. Anywhere. The number one source of complaints are what we call whistleblowers. And whistleblowers tend to be auditors who do not give us their name, and you don't have to give us your name. No one has to give us your name, whether you're a factory or you're a brand, but it's typically auditors themselves who do a great job of self-reporting. Audit firms are number 2. So our own members are number 1 and number 2 in letting the industry know when they find problems. Factories have talked to us. Brands have talked to us. NGOs have talked to us. So all of these are sources of complaints. If any of you listening have evidence that there is something going on in the factory where there was an ethical issue, fraud, bribery, or in an incompetent audit, please let us know. And the website is, I believe, professionalconduct@theapsca.org, and I can post it here in the chat. And then the question everyone wants to know is, what are the number types of cases? The number one type of case we receive is what we call fraudulent use of credentials, which is a broad term, but let me give you an example of what I mean. It's when, for example, an auditor says, I conducted an audit, but APSCA's evidence says you didn't, where the auditor basically did not tell the truth and said, I audited this factory, but they were never there. behind the scenes with groups like amfori and our members, we have monthly and quarterly reporting where data is being shared back and forth. So independent of what the firms are doing and what the collaborative programs are doing, we can see across all of the global spectrum and be able to compare and contrast where auditors are and where they aren't. And for example, there's a case that we're wrapping up now where one auditor said that he was actually conducted 4 audits in 2 days in 2 different cities for a number of different firms. Obviously, that can't happen unless this person was Superman, and they were not. And we were able to find out that they fraudulently reported their presence, their APSCA number at an audit when they weren't there. The second most common type of case is bribery. And that is, when I say zero tolerance, bribery is not only do you lose your license as an auditor if you've accepted a bribe, you can't get it back. It is a permanent sanction, not one that we take lightly, but it goes to the heart of the profession, the integrity of the profession. And so that is case number 2. I will say, despite the severity of these examples I've given, out of those 450 cases we expect this year, there's a spectrum of cases. It's not just all serious. There are some where I forgot to put my number down, I got the date wrong, I didn't fill this thing out as well. So just because it's an ethics case doesn't mean it's serious. The goal isn't to penalize people, it's to improve. So we try to, the process will reflect what we think is the severity of the issue. So if it's, look, I just made a mistake, it was a one-time thing, I kind of forgot, and it didn't impact the quality of the assessment, then we'll work with you to kind of improve that and make sure it doesn't happen again.
You partially answered, Ross, one of the questions that's in the Q&A, which is about reinstatement of auditors. So you just said for bribery, it's not, once your credentials are revoked, it's not possible to ever get them back. You can never remedy that. Are there other sorts of violations that you maybe you can be reinstated for, or?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, Laura. You know, and as I alluded to just now, that a violation doesn't even necessarily need to a suspension. Most of the violations yield no discipline at all. We issue what's called a letter of expectation. We say, hey, look, you kind of made a mistake. Here's what you did. Here's the code revision. Here's how you can make sure you don't do it again. That is the vast majority of when we work with auditors and firms, is the letter of expectation to say, let's just work together, because firms and auditors staying within APSCA, staying within the profession and learning is way better than having them no longer be part of the profession. So most of what we do is what we call a letter of expectation, and then it can escalate depending on the severity of the issue, the frequency of the issue, how many people were impacted. We can have very short-term suspensions, 1 month, 2 month, up to 6 months, and in some cases a year. So we have this very sliding scale that reflects the severity of the issue.
There's a question in there about whether there's a public list of the collaborative initiatives that require APSCA certified auditors. Is that on your website, Ross, or Linda, in your case, presumably, you've already said it verbally here, but presumably it's part of your expectation and written clearly that you will only allow audits done by certified social compliance auditors.
Certainly take a look at the website. The second slide that I put up today was a sample of both firms and the collaborative programs we work with, and the brands and companies that are express supporters. Again, if you take a look at the website, you'll see firms, you'll see collaborative programs like amfori, you'll see member firms like Intertek, and then you'll see brands and retailers that are express supporters of APSCA as well. So you'll see Carrefour on there. You'll see PepsiCo on there. A lot of those brands that we work with to also address the industry. And it's a really good point that while we have member firms and member auditors, that's not the end of it. We have collaborative programs with amfori. We have stakeholders from the brands and the retailers, the ones that commission the work, and they want to see the professionalization of the social compliance auditing industry as well. So it is really, we try to pull in all the players in the ecosystem. We meet with global union federations. We meet with CSOs. We meet with standard setting associations. Everyone has a role at the table.
May I just quickly chip in just to make sure there is no unclarity here, Ross? Your members are auditors and auditing companies. The others are stakeholders and not members. And just to be
Correct.
very clear here, there's a different role here also in, say, the governance of the of APSCA. Just wanted to clarify that. Thanks.
Someone was asking in the Q&A, will APSCA certified auditors conduct CSDDD assessments? Can some of you talk a little bit about the difference between conducting an audit and being in compliance with, let's presume CSDDD passes in its current form for now, for the purposes of this conversation? Does anyone want to take that and kind of distinguish between the different pieces?
Yeah,
I think Michaela has raised her hand on that one. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't think there will be an official scheme from governments or the EU or the Commission to put a stamp on CSDDD compliant for the in-scope companies or for their suppliers who might be out of scope. Sometimes companies in Germany ask whether they could be blacklists or whitelists for the Supply Chain Act, and ideally they want the governments of Germany or other countries to monitor suppliers in third countries and how they're performing in relation to human rights and the environment. And I have very many question marks in my head in relation to how they would be able to do that. I think I'm not a sovereign state, obviously I'm a person, but like I think sovereign states would very much dislike other governments from the EU coming over saying, like, I'm going to now assess whether you're in compliance of our actually laws or like the standards to which we take recourse in our domestic legislation. And then obviously we need to differentiate like being in compliant with the due diligence obligations of the CSDDD or the Supply Chain Act, which are very, very similar actually, means that companies have to have established this risk management system that consists of different elements: risk analysis measures, grievance mechanism, reporting or communication, having established processes and procedures in the CSDDD, also the climate plan, stakeholder engagement. And then these measures, these due diligence elements relate to protected legal positions. And this is where the audit's relevance, I think, in my opinion, comes in. And then obviously you have a whole list of human rights positions and then environmental positions, and companies need to then take a risk-based approach to see whether there are negative impacts, potential actual negative impacts at, for example, their suppliers level in their own operations and their subsidiaries and so on. And so what the CSDDD does not want, the Supply Chain Act does not want, they don't want the obliged companies to make sure that all of their suppliers also implement a risk management system. This is not the point of the directive or the Supply Chain Act. This is definitely a good thing if suppliers also implement a risk management system, but actually what the obliged company has to do is they have to assess and then enable their suppliers in meeting these material standards in relation to human rights and the environment.
We are going to just try to answer one or two more questions that have come through the Q&A, and then I actually want to ask each of the panelists to just make a closing remark. It could just be a minute or so. If there's anything that you wanted to make sure that we got expressed, or as you look at the Q&A yourself, if you see any areas that really deserve follow-up or a clear answer, please let me know. So with Ross, there's an interesting question there about rewards and recognition programs for auditors. Is there anything that APSCA is doing, or maybe collaborative initiatives or audit firms are doing this too? But how are good auditors identified, rewarded, and recognizing, and what role does that play in kind of raising the floor for what the expectation is around good social compliance auditing?
Linda, I didn't know if you want to take that first. At APSCA, certainly we celebrate everyone who does good work, and in fact, stay tuned. Auditor number 3000 is going to have a special a special focus. But APSCA is the standards oversight body. I think the firms in the collaborative programs are much closer to that day-to-day, like, is the auditor doing a good job and doing all that sort of stuff? And certainly, I would recommend rewarding auditors for good jobs and as much as possible. But really, that engagement with the auditors is really done at the firm level. And APSCA, we want to oversee the entire industry, but not necessarily sort of dictate how firms work with their auditors. But Linda, maybe you have some more concrete example.
Well, I have to admit, I was trying to scroll through the questions, and I wasn't really paying attention because I thought it was directed to you. So then I thought I'm going to read the questions here. But maybe just respond to what you just said about how our interaction is, say, with the individual auditors. I think maybe more important is, because we work with a limited number of auditing companies that are our monitoring partners, I think that's where we have a very intense engagement with, first and foremost, because they should offer the oversight, they should take care of the auditors, in many ways being a good employer to start with, but also helping them, say, in development. And of course, we play our piece here. But what we also do, and I think, again, here this collaboration is shown, is that we have what we call calibration meetings. And that's where we bring our monitoring partners, all of them in the same room, and yes, they are competitors, to really discuss topics that are relevant for everyone, topics that we observe in the industry in specific countries, specific issues, topics related to implementation of what we have written in our, say, auditing protocol, but also issues that are, for example, related to shortage of auditors in specific regions. And so I think, just commenting on that one, I think that's really, really super important. We do that twice a year, the global level. Also do that at local, within, say, our key sourcing countries. The same methodology is being applied at this point in time, because I think that's really crucial in advancing and tackling together. So I'm going to pause here now, but collaboration is the key word.
All right, we're going to start to wrap it up here. I'm going to ask two questions that also are coming up in the chat, but I'd like the panelists to just go around, make your final comments. If you can reflect upon these questions, please do. If not, that's fine. One question is about what happens after the audit is done. And I know sometimes, we talk about the kind of, there's an auditing ecosystem where different actors play different roles. So if you can talk about that. And then there's been another question about the difference between auditing and consulting. And there are certain organizations that provide both auditing services and consulting services, and kind of how do you kind of manage having sort of a little bit of a wall between those activities. So if anyone wants to answer those, please do, but let's just go around and just please make final comments just in the last 2 to 3 minutes here. Does anyone want to go first?
I can go first, perhaps, Laura. As a practicing auditor, perhaps we can focus on continuous education due to rapidly changing regulatory requirements and emerging social issues and trends. And of course, a strong commitment to management systems for a high standard of audit quality and integrity to stay tuned with all the requirements going on right now.
Yeah, and just very briefly, I think actually the role of audits from the perspective of companies, I think, is changing now, because for a while, I believe companies were more interested in hearing that everything was okay. And now they are starting to realize that some companies still think that the point of the risk analysis is to find no risks, sadly, but they're slowly starting to realize that they now need to figure out how things actually are to then design measures based on that. I think with this changing expectation of companies in relation to audit, which is also pushed obviously by the CSDDD and the recital we talked about, I hope also the incentives they set in relation to their auditors and the measures that they implement, ensuring integrity and reliability of audits, will change. And companies are often worried if there's too many risks that they have to address all of them and they will exceed their capacities. And this is really something they don't have to worry about, because they have to prioritize, and this also means prioritize based on the resource they have available. And I think one last thing that companies can do in addition to looking at the integrity of audits and fitness criteria to assess audits and so on, I think they should also look at what incentives they might be setting with their own behavior to suppliers to engage in audit fraud. And what I mean by that is look at like how is the collaboration between them and the suppliers. So talking about code of conducts, contracts, and also purchasing practices.
If I may, very quickly, audit and consulting can't go hand in hand, can't be the same person, can't be the same company, very clear. And secondly, what happens after the audit, because I think that's where the work starts. You will need to really work on the issues being identified. Some are minor, some might be major, which we call zero tolerance, but it's working on those. And again, Michaela, thank you for saying it. It's not about being perfect, but it's really making sure that you work on the issues and do better tomorrow, because no one is perfect. Thank you.
And my last word is on that conflict of interest in consulting that is expressly covered under APSCA's Code of Conduct. I hear you on that one. And a definition of a competent audit also includes a re-audit to make sure that remediation efforts have been effective. So the initial audit and the follow-up are both considered a competent audit in general. And to our member firms and auditors, thank you, and thank you everyone for attending.
Yeah, so that wraps us up. I want to thank the 700 or so people who stuck with us. That's an extraordinary amount of people who are interested in this subject. I hope we were able to go a level deeper on social compliance auditing and how it fits into human rights due diligence. You should certainly feel free to follow up with our panelists. They've got public websites, and I'm sure they would really appreciate your follow-up questions. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the OECD for allowing us to have this session. Thank you.
Thank you all.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.